Hi, and welcome to the club. This is my first attempt at the CLA Virtual Club self-recording video. And today I want to talk about a book I just, not too long ago, I should say, finished reading. It's called Yurugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. By Marimba Ani. This was published in 1994. So some of what it talks about, I think, we've already been discussing in, critical theory and analysis and so on. But it is a very interesting premise for its time because she is attempting to do something that really wasn't done before in any collected sort of way. But before I get into that, I just want to mention that if you are planning to read this, it is 569 pages long, and I am not counting in notes or references. So that's 569 pages of actual text to read. I will be honest, I did not make it all the way through. I still have the conclusion to read. I made it as far as 530 something pages before giving up, really. But I will say part of the reason I gave up is because I think I got the premise of the book, and also what got me to 530 something pages was the fact I was looking for an expansion because of some of the issues I had with the text, right? So this is a non-fiction text, so I'm not going to be breaking my one rule, which is no spoilers if it's fiction. It's interesting because it's an ethnographic study of Europe and European culture. And for the time in the 90s, this is flipping the idea of ethnography on its head, because it was pretty much ethnography coming out of anthropology, and anthropology itself was pretty much the European or white going out and watching cultural others and say, aren't they interesting and aren't they quaint, right? And then she actually makes an argument that that kind of anthropology and ethnography was in service to the core of the Europeans' need to feel superior, right? So like I said, very interesting premises in the text. The first, let me backtrack a little bit. So I said it a little bit just now. She's arguing essentially that at the very core of European culture is this need to feel superior, to dominate. And this, according to her, becomes solidified when Plato argues that to know something is to separate the self from the object. So objectification, right? So where most cultures in the world, we are part of a larger interconnected universe or cosmos, and we feel ourselves interconnected and we know ourselves by our interconnections. For Plato, for anyone to really understand anything, one must separate the self from the object, so objectification. And this is a relatively difficult concept if you have been schooled in Western style education, because this is the very core of the scientific method. Things are observable, things are separate, take yourself out of your analysis. And I don't think she means necessarily to be subjective and that there's no right or wrong. That's also part of the difficulty in reading this kind of book, because we've also been conditioned to think in binaries. So it's not necessarily that we should not observe something as neutrally as possible, right? Or think of ourselves or think of the object itself outside of its relation to us. But in European culture, through Plato's teachings, this becomes an amplified, not just amplified, the way to think, right? And so this objectification naturally leads to despiritualization in the culture. And spiritualization here, or spirituality here, really means that connection, that interconnectivity, that assurance that we are part of a larger whole and that we are all interconnected, right? So the idea that knowledge is both material and immaterial. So through objectification, through what is observable, what is tangible, essentially, the culture starts to reject this idea of this larger cosmos and this interconnectivity. This also leads to them othering non-Europeans. So she stresses, as she calls them, she reframes the idea of first world, and she talks about first world peoples being the majority peoples, meaning melanated people around the world, so African, Asian, Native American, and so on, right? And stresses the idea that Europeans themselves are globally a minority, which demographically speaking is very true, right? And so there's a line from objectifying to despiritualization to othering. So it becomes increasingly easy in the European culture to think of yourself in isolation, right? So the idea of individualism, materialism, and how these support capitalism and so on, all are sparked from this seed, a cultural seed, what she calls the asili, the need to dominate, the need to be superior. Very interesting, but these are, again, in African American lit criticism, these are, by now fairly standard ideas to think about, to the point where for despiritualization, I like to joke, when you're watching horror movies, predominantly white horror movies, why don't these people have instincts? Don't you feel that? Don't you sense that? But again, it's this idea that you are isolated from the universe. So those vibrations the rest of us feel, that those little warning signs, those that antenna are either not felt at all or completely ignored. So there was a bit of confirmation bias, I guess, in reading this text, because I'm coming to it about 31 years after it would have been fresh. These are ideas, I think, that are working its way into decolonizing theory, and other things like that. One of the most important takeaways from this book for me is just how deep we need to go with decolonization, because in addition to what comes out of the othering, or part and parcel of the othering, I should say, and the need to be superior is to brainwash everyone else into thinking European culture is the standard to follow. So progress is materialistic, and that's how progress should be measured. Academia or intelligence should be primarily based on literacy and not lived experience, or as is also called embodied knowledge, right? So cultures that rely heavily on music and dance to communicate are looked down upon because it's oral, not written. And so these are concepts we've been dealing with, I would say in the last maybe 30 something years, but I would still suggest that this book was one of the vanguards collecting all this information into one book. So I like it for that. Um, but here's kind of why I stress that it's 569 pages long. I think that point is made fairly early in the book, right? And what we get after that are um, almost redundancy in trying to explain the concept, right? The other thing I that doesn't sit well with me is that I think it needed to be more nuanced in that in the end, and this could just be because she relies on a colonizing language like English in the first place. In the end, she monolithized, it's not really a word, that's why I can't say it. She makes a monolith of European culture. And for me, it reads more like a critique of European American culture than European culture as a whole, one. And in not differentiating based on gender or class in any sustained way, right? You kind of get a skewed picture that all Europeans think this way. And I'm not exactly sure all do. When you look at their artists and so you can see people who are not necessarily in alignment with this a silly 100%, this germinating thought that we must dominate, we must be on top, we are superior. Although to degrees, yes, so it's a little more complicated, but she makes it feel like one size fits all, and I think that's a bit problematic. And that is because when we look at how, or when we look at the germination of oppressive behaviors coming out of Europe and European Americans, we also have to remember that these are behaviors they inflicted on each other first. The first British colony, for example, was Ireland, right? They enslaved each other before Christianity took hold in Europe, right? They still other based on gender and class. So there are intersections of othering. And another way I put this in a review I did a while ago is intersections or privilege negotiation. And so what we find in modern society now is that in any given situation, we are negotiating what privileges we have and we are acting on that, right? And so it depends on where you are. So if you are a white woman in an all-white boardroom, for example, right, you have very limited privilege in that space. If you're a white woman in a mixed boardroom, right, let's say of maybe white and minorities, right, women, men, mixed, far more mixed, you might have more privilege in that situation because you can align your power to the white men in the room, for example. So I think she's a good starting point for these kind of thinking, this kind of thinking, this kind of thought. But we need to nuance the idea a little bit more, right? It could be that moving down the scale, so moving down the scale in terms of, to apply a bit of a Marxist idea here, your proximity to power affects how this need to be superior or need to dominate is enacted, or if it's enacted at all, right? Some of it, I will admit, is subconscious. Some of it, you don't know you're doing it until you're in that situation, but there are people who are willing to wake up from that situation. And I'm really thinking about people in the arts, music specifically. I'm thinking about a lot about European musicians when I imagine this kind of scenario, right? A lot of the musicians we like actively acknowledge, seek out, and revere, right? They align themselves with Black musicians from America, for example, based on class rather than race. I mean, we do have some people who are more problematic than that. We ain't gonna say it. There's always problematic, but there is also space for a more human exchange to happen, right? So I would recommend reading it if you have the time. If you want to read it but might not have all the time in the world, then we can go back to our grad school days. I would say read the introduction and read the conclusion. And I think you would get the premise based on that. It was a very interesting read. It took me forever, but that's only because the time I had was reading before bed. We all know what that's like. So yeah, thank you so much. Now I hope to see a video from you all.